You know, I took like 4 or 5 years of Spanish. Actually, from 8th grade to 12th grade. That's 5 years I took Spanish. And I can understand a lot. I know a lot of words, but I've never lived in a place where I was able to speak it and become fluent.
Well, maybe you'll have to move again.
So maybe we'll hit the lottery.
New Jersey wasn't enough. There's a particular part of New Jersey where there are a lot of Cubans.
Do they have a podcast?
Don't know about that.
So if we hit the lottery, Alan, what I'll do is, and you can come with me, and I'll pay for everything, because if I win the lottery, I'll have the money. We'll go to all the Spanish-speaking countries on a podcast tour, and that's how I'll learn how to speak fluent.
And Barry too, right?
Spanish. And Barry too.
Barry can come along with us.
Oh yeah.
Of course. Barry, what do you think about oh no, I can't do that. Sometimes I think of a question and an answer and it's not politically correct. And then
I understand.
You know what I mean? I don't want to do it. Like, Barry, what do you think about taking a tour of all the Spanish-speaking countries?
That's frightening.
Oh, what do you mean it's frightening? No, it's not. Think about the food, Barry, right?
Yeah, oh yeah.
Okay. Well, we got to get this started.
Okay, well, let's get it started.
I guess I got to hit this button. Let's do it. Here we go! Yes! Yeah, that's right. We are here. You are here. I'm here. And my special guest is here, Allan Tepper. I'm going to introduce him in a second. But I'm so glad you're here. This is the Podcast Engineering Show. My name is Chris Curran. I produce podcasts for mid to large companies. And every week on this show, we bring you podcast production techniques on a silver platter. We really talk shop. We get technical. I have a background in audio engineering in the music business, and I've been producing podcasts at an advanced level for many years now, so I kind of combine those two. And what it means for you is if you apply and utilize the best of what you hear on this show, your podcast will sound a lot better and you'll spend less time producing them. And of course, Barry's with me. I didn't fade out the music quick enough. So you want to hear Barry really soft with the music?
Yeah, oh yeah. Yeah, oh yeah.
Oh, I hit the one button for Barry saying yeah, oh yeah, and it faded out the music real quick. Anyway, that's interesting.
Don't you hate when that happens?
This little soundboard, right? Well, I didn't configure it. I just play.
I have this visualization. You know, we talk when we talk about audio, we often talk about sampling frequencies, and of course we always make reference to Hertz, but we don't talk about the guy, Heinrich Rudolf Hertz,
right,
who is named for, who died in 1894. But I have this visualization of Barry time traveling and having a beer with Heinrich Rudolf Hertz because his face kind of matches the voice. Of course, you've met Barry, but I haven't seen his face. I've only heard his voice.
Right.
But as far as I'm concerned, they have a very similar type face, so they'd probably get along. What do you think about that idea?
That's a great
idea. I want to
idea.
ask Barry.
Barry, you like it?
Yeah, oh yeah.
I can imagine them having a beer, talking.
Barry, but do you want to grow?
It's great to be here.
Do you want to grow a beard, Barry?
No way. You crazy?
All right, he doesn't want to grow a beard, Alan.
Well, he could be the twin brother without the beard. That's okay. Great to be here.
Allan Tepper is here, everybody. That's right. Did you hear that? I know you've been to allantepper.com and you see all his... He writes great tech articles on gear, on tech. He's a tech journalist, actually, and he also is a pro audio and video specialist. And I know, Alan, a lot of companies send you gear and you get to play with it and kind of review it, right?
That's true. And the list is growing, and so is my desk full of devices that I'm supposed to be reviewing in the next couple of days or weeks. Sometimes they have an embargo, and the review has to be published by a certain date, and sometimes an exact time of the day in a certain time zone of the world.
Wow.
And sometimes there's no pressure at all. But yes, that's one of the wonderful things that I do. It's not the only thing that I do. I also do consulting, and I was just recently in Mexico setting up a multi-camera studio, and I was in Spain doing a WordPress security seminar in Madrid, Spain, right at the same time that they were having the referendum in Catalonia about the later on in the month, last Friday, they did declare their independence from Spain. So it was an interesting time to be in Spain.
Oh, wow. That's interesting. I'm going to ask you about setting up that multi-camera studio in Mexico, but you're also a broadcaster, so you host shows too, right?
Yes, I do. My Capicu FM show just surpassed 300,000 listens the other day, so I'm happy about that.
Nice.
And I'm happy to be back in my normal frequency of episodes per month. We recently had a hurricane in Florida, which means that we were out of power for a couple of weeks. And then I had these unexpected trips to Portugal, Spain, and then Mexico. But the other day I published another episode, so I'm back in track with that, and I love doing that show.
Very cool. All right, well, we're going to do the speed round right now. There's no time like the present. So within, let's say, about 60 seconds, or actually, so wait, is the recording setup you're using right now, the microphone and the interface and stuff, is that your normal setup that you do your show from, or is this a special setup?
For me, nothing is normal because I'm constantly testing new equipment. So I'm constantly juggling equipment, and sometimes I have to return it, sometimes I don't. So today, let's do the speed round for today.
Yes.
Which is fairly simple. I'm using the Rode Broadcaster microphone, which I understand you recently purchased one of those. So congratulations on that. I don't know if you're using it right now or not, but congratulations.
Yeah, and guess what? It's actually going to arrive today.
Okay.
So right now I'm still using my RE20, but later today my Rode Broadcaster is going to arrive. I'm so psyched. All right, continue.
Okay, well, I'm sure you're going to be turning your game way down.
Yeah. Yep.
Because this has a very high output as opposed to the RE20, which has a very low output.
Right.
And that's going into a new interface that I have not reviewed yet, although by the time you publish this episode, this review will probably be up on ProVideoCoalition.com, which is the magazine where I've been publishing reviews and technical articles and workflow articles and things like that since 2008. But this is a new interface. It's actually the third generation of this particular type of interface from an Italian company called IK Multimedia, which I don't think I've ever heard mentioned on your show before. And it's called the iRig Pre HD. So that's the interface that I'm going into right now. That is going into via USB into my MacBook Air. And right now we are connected through a web service. So I'm not running any other special software other than Chrome, which is a requirement for the system that you're using today. So that's my, what's the word for it? Roundup?
That's your speed round.
My speed round. My speed round for today is that, but there's no such thing as normal. In other words, sometimes I'm in the field doing a recording in the field and I have two microphones connected to an H5 recorder. Sometimes I'm in the studio and sometimes I do have a multi-interface unit here and I have a guest connected that way. You know, it's constantly changing, but that's what it is today. And I can talk about, you know, the general workflow of the audio part, not counting the stuff that goes beyond what you usually cover in your show. But I usually edit with a program that's not so common in the United States. It's called Hindenburg Journalist Pro. I think you might have mentioned it once on your show. Have you covered that before?
A little bit, yeah. I've mentioned it because I've seen Hindenburg at a bunch of the shows, and a couple of prominent podcasters actually use it. Like Dave Jackson uses Hindenburg Journalist Pro.
Exactly. Dave uses it. I'm not sure if Dave uses the Pro version or not. They're very similar. There are only a couple of minor differences, but there's a huge difference in price. Mm-hmm. I'm not sure about that, but I love that program for a few different reasons, and I published at least a half a dozen different articles. One was a general review, one was how to use it with Skype, and then there were a few other ones when they came out with updates and I needed to update my readers about what new features had been added to it. So I love that program for editing audio stories, which is, I guess, the way we can describe the general way we do these kinds of shows. They're audio stories, whether they have a lot of editing or a little bit of editing, they're still audio stories. They're not targeted for musicians the way most of the other multi-track audio, what is commonly known as a DAW or a
software
digital audio workstation.
Right.
This one is not targeted to musicians. It's targeted to audio storytellers. So it's missing some of the really deep features that are in a musician type of a program, but it does include some other features that helps us get our job done more efficiently. So that's one of the reasons that I like it. And I also am a strong user and promoter of Auphonic, and I have published at least 3 or 4 different articles about Auphonic. Its general use, it's used for transcoding, to create visual versions of the audio, which they call an audiogram. So I've covered them quite a bit also. So I guess that pretty much concludes the speed round. It might have been extended.
No, that's good. You covered it. You nailed it. This is good. So the Rode Broadcaster. Now, did you choose that? Like, I'm sure you've tried many, many different microphones. And is that like your choice? Is that your winner, the one you love the most?
Well, I've only had it a very short time, and it is one of the ones that I requested from Rode. Sometimes a manufacturer requests me. They say, we have this, would you like to review this? And sometimes I request it. So that was one that I had requested. And you may have seen my review, but I said that it's a microphone that challenges I'm trying to remember the words that I used to describe it.
Oh, yeah, I actually have it up right here, yeah. Rode Broadcaster, the voice microphone that challenges conventional wisdom.
Exactly, because the conventional wisdom is if you're in an untreated room, which is what I'm in right now, the general consensus is we need to use a dynamic mic in order to get rid of the room noise and the room reflections and things like that. And this is one of 2 condenser microphones that I've discovered that challenge that.
Right.
So I had heard that, I had seen it in other people who had reviewed it, and I wanted to review it myself. So it was one of 3 things that I requested this time from Rode. I have reviewed many, many devices from Rode in the past, but this is in this most current request that I did. It's the second microphone of the batch that I reviewed. The other one is a specific type of a shotgun that you put on top of a camera, so it's really not appropriate for the type of production that you cover in this show. But that's the one that I did before, and the one I'm about to publish a review on is actually an interface, and we can go into that later on if you want, but we're sure. Talking right now about this microphone. One of the things that's unique about this microphone is that it has a tally light. It's the only microphone I think I've ever seen with a built-in tally light. A tally light is something that we know in television as the light on the camera to let the talent, the people that are in the studio, the hosts, to know which camera is active. But in a radio studio, it can basically tell the on-air talent whether their mic is open or not, and possibly even more so in the case of a guest. But that's that particular feature in the microphone. It really only works correctly if you connect to a broadcast board that has that type of a relay connection. Right. Just like if you've ever been in a radio studio, live studio, there's usually a sign that says on air, and that's usually right. connected to the board, and it turns on and off depending upon whether the mics are open or not. And also there's usually a muted power output, which is connected to the speakers there, and that's another way of telling the talent, and that's also the case because I've been in live news TV studios, where when the talent hear sounds from the speakers blaring in, they know that their
right.
their microphone is not on, and they can say anything. They can even say one of the 7 words that George Carlin says cannot be said on television or radio. They can say those words because if they hear that, they know that their microphone, there's no way that it can be on. Whereas right. all of a sudden when it goes quiet, they know that their mic is open, and instantly shut up. Not only the talent, but also the stagehands and the everybody that's just around immediately shuts up because they know that they can be heard. So that type of a connection is something that's present with certain boards, which are generally called broadcast boards, broadcast mixers, whether they're marketed for radio or for television. They usually have a couple of things that are not in other mixers, including the automatically muted studio monitors and also the connection for an on-air light, which would be the same type of a connection that you would wire up to that pin of the extra conductor that you need to make that work with the broadcast, the Rode broadcaster mic that is the one that I'm talking to right now. So the way it works, if you don't have that type of a board, and I do not have one, and I did not have one when I did the review, it's just on all the time. When it senses phantom power, it's on. So it's a cool thing to have, but it doesn't actually have the function. So when you connect yours, you're going to see the light turn on. It's just going to be on until you shut off the source of the phantom power or disconnect it or something.
That's cool. Yeah, I can't wait to get it and try it. It's a large diaphragm condenser, but it apparently has a cardioid pattern, probably that is average. I wouldn't say it's tight, but yeah, it apparently doesn't pick up all the sound in the room. I'm really psyched to try it.
Yes, I think it's actually two different factors, and I think some people only think about the pattern, and the pattern is definitely one of the important factors to determine that. And the other one is just the I'm trying to think of a good word for it in English, but the trail off. In other words, when you get a certain distance away and then another distance away and another distance away, I think that's the thing that we associate more with dynamic versus condenser, is that trail off of the distance. So I think both factors are important. You've covered, and I used to use, and I had covered in the past. I did a complete review on the BP40 from Audio-Technica, which is another company that often sends me microphones to review. That one has a supercardioid pattern, and it's dynamic. So it's even a combination of the two. But there are advantages of everything, and I love dynamic microphones for certain reasons, and I love condenser microphones for other reasons. But people need to understand that if they're going to use a dynamic, whether it's the really, really hungry gain ones or the not so demanding ones, you do need to make sure that you use a preamp that has enough gain, or use what I like to describe as a preamp, and I know you've covered them before, like the Fethead and the Cloud Lifter and their competitors. And I think that if you're starting from scratch, it really makes sense. If you're thinking about using dynamic mics, I think it makes sense just to choose an interface or a board that already has enough gain. I think that the Band-Aid of using something like a Fethead is good if you are already kind of tied into something that you already own. But if you're going to start from scratch, since there are boards and interfaces, and we use the term interface as a blanket term to cover what's both a preamp and an A to D converter, since they do exist with enough gain, and it doesn't necessarily have to cost a fortune to get them, then it just, instead of having a whole bunch of different devices, if you can simplify it, I think it makes more sense. But if you already have something that you're in love with, a particular board, or even if it's a camera that doesn't have enough gain on the input, then by all means, use something like a Fethead. I don't know if you've tried them. I'm sure you've read about them or heard about them.
Yeah, the Fethead and the Cloud Lifter. Yeah, and even Travis Hill, who's been on the show before, who kind of tests and reviews microphones. He actually did a test and a review of the Fethead versus the Cloud Lifter, and it's a video on YouTube. I think it's called podcastmic.com is his website. But yeah, we've talked about them, and they're very handy for a lot of reasons. But I agree with you. If you can just buy either a mixer or a mic pre or an interface that has a good mic pre in it, and then you don't need extra stuff, because the less devices you have in the signal chain, usually the better. It's just a more pure signal, right?
Exactly, and it's a one less potential point of failure.
Right.
And
yes.
I think some people have to think, well, am I better off with an interface or a board or a broadcast board? And earlier on, we talked about the differences with a broadcast board. Go ahead. I didn't mean to interrupt you.
Oh, no. I just was on the, I just pulled up the IK Multimedia website because I've heard, that's it, T-Rax. I was looking at, I've heard IK Multimedia before, and I was like, well, what products do they make? And I know they make a lot. They make microphones and the iRig stuff. And
I mainly cover their microphones and their interfaces, but they actually were born with their software. The thing is that just about all of their software is really made for musicians.
Right.
So it doesn't really help us so much, because I don't know if you're a musician, but I'm not a musician. So their software is really not so helpful for me. And up until very recently, and we can talk about this, but I'm an evangelist for 48 kilohertz audio sampling.
Right.
I think we should all abandon 44.1 kilohertz sampling for many reasons that I covered in the article about that. And up until very, very recently, their software for mobile devices only supported 44.1, even though their hardware department was always supporting 48 kilohertz. So I always would applaud the good things in their hardware, but I used to say, but I can't recommend their software, and I would recommend another piece of software. In fact, nowadays, if you just want to record audio, either in iPhone or in Android, one of my favorite audio recordings for that happens to be the Auphonic app. Whether or not you even use their service online or not, just the recording app, which allows you to record directly to wave, is great, and it gives you the option of recording at 48 kilohertz if you want to. I'm not saying that everyone needs to, but I happen to recommend it for several reasons, and one of the reasons that I recommend it is because it's the standard for video production. And if you are ever going to be involved in a video production, even if somebody is just going to come and record video of you while you're producing your show, you don't want to have to give them something that's going to cause them headaches when they're editing. In fact, I've had clients who have made a mistake and they've done an entire music video, and I won't mention the person's name, but it's a woman, and her boyfriend happened to be a sound person. That's what he did for a living, and she was having trouble editing. And the reason that she was having trouble is because they mistakenly did everything at 44.1, and that's not the standard for video, so everything was getting out of sync. And when I started to say that they really needed to have done it in 48, and we had to do a few hours of work to fix everything, he kept on saying, but there's practically not any difference in quality between 44.1 and 48. And I responded to him and I said, it's not an issue of the quality. It's a question of being the standard and being able to match the standard that's in the timeline when you're editing the video and when you're distributing the video. And also, sometimes when people upsample, they actually get artifacts during the conversion. So if we can avoid it and start at 48, we're better off. Even if it has to be down converted later for some reason for a particular platform, I don't think people should be, in the United States at least, the compact disc is basically dead as far as sales of music. It's just a tiny percentage of the percentage of sales. So I think that we're better off starting out at the standard of 48, and if for those tiny percentage of the market that needs still the compact disc, let that be the exception, and let be that one the one that has to be downsampled and not the opposite.
Right. I actually did read your article on that, and I agree with you 100%. And you know what happened to me recently? I had a realization that about maybe 6 months ago or 9 months ago, I can't remember, I started using iZotope RX. Well, I started with RX5 Advanced, but now I upgraded to RX6 Advanced. And that's my last step in podcast production. I bring in my final mix, the final wave into RX6 Advanced, and then I level it first to the LUFS level, and then I export it as an MP3, because the MP3, it's that whatever Haupenfraffer or whatever whatever codec is the MP3 codec. RX6 uses that, and I used to always save, using SoundForge, I used to always save my MP3s as the standard, 128 kilobits per second, 44.1 kilohertz, right? That's pretty much the Redbook standard MP3. And then I was looking at an MP3 that I had done, and it said 48 kilohertz on the MP3, and this is a more recent one. And I was like, why is the MP3 48? Well, the reason is because when I bring the wave into RX6, the wave itself is 24-bit, 48 kilohertz. That's my standard resolution, the high resolution for recording and editing and basically everything. And so when I export it as an MP3, it definitely compresses it down to 128 kilobits per second, but it keeps the 48K and it plays fine everywhere.
The sampling frequency maintains the resolution. In other words, whether the original was 16 or 24, and I happen to have another article, and I'm also a promoter of producing in 24, even though today it's not always feasible to distribute in 24. Definitely we should be producing in 24, because when we get our raw recordings, we want to have the cleanest possible signal with the least amount of artifacts when we normalize. I think we talked a little bit off air before about normally we want to make our raw recordings at minus 12 dB, or some people might be a little bit higher or lower, and later on we normalize it. Well, if we make our original recordings at 24, then we have so many more levels available in the recording, and there will be less artifacts when we normalize. And even if we have to distribute in something that's not 24, now when you have an MP3, that's not handled the same way. So you're absolutely correct. It does retain the 48 kilohertz, but it doesn't retain the 24-bit, because the way the levels are handled in MP3 is different. And it's tied to the bit rate, but it's not directly reflected by the number of the bit rate, because it's changing all the time. But that's true. And I do all of my production in 48 kilohertz, and I encourage a lot of other companies to do that, including ACX. I don't know if ACX, I haven't checked in a few months, ACX, which is the division of Amazon that does audiobook production. I don't know if they've, because a lot of times people read my articles and they take my advice, but then they don't contact me, so I don't know if they did or not. But a lot of other companies did, and a lot of software, both on desktop computers and in iOS, have added 48 kilohertz to their software. Sometimes it takes a year, but it's good when those things happen. And I'm glad to know that you're doing 48 kilohertz also.
Yeah, and I think one of the things for listeners to take away from this is that, again, that I've been publishing my MP3s at 128 kilobits per second stereo and at 48 kilohertz, and it doesn't hurt any MP3 players. It doesn't.
No, there's a myth. There's a myth that some MP3 players can't play 48 kilohertz, but those are $20 players that stopped being manufactured at least 10 years ago. So anything modern will play it with no problem.
Right. So I just looked up this IK Multimedia iRig Pre HD. It looks like it's a $99 item. Looks like it's really small. It's just made for one microphone, and then you plug it into either a computer or a device, right?
Yes, and it does work in 48 kilohertz, which is the way I have it set up, and it does have 24-bit. So and that's something that we should talk about as far as preamps is concerned. It seems like there are different generations of preamps, and there was a time, and that's the case with a lot of the ones that are in a lot of interfaces and a lot of mixers, where if you go after 50 or 60%, then they start to introduce hiss. But it seems like the ones that they're using in these new ones from IK Multimedia, they're kind of a different generation of preamps, because even if you max it out, you don't hear any hiss the way we used to in the past.
Oh, okay.
So I think it's some kind of a generational thing. I don't know the actual chip that they're using. I don't know if it's a proprietary one or if they buy it off the shelf. But it seems like things are changing all the time, and we don't necessarily need to apply the conventional wisdom, because the conventional wisdom is if you go over 6 or 7, you're going to, and that is the case.
Right.
Like in the one that's built into my H5, the Zoom H5 recorder,
Yeah.
if you go over 5 or 6, you start to get hiss. And
Right.
some of the hiss is really there, and some of this is just because the fact that the headphone amp, I shouldn't say preamp in that case, the headphone amplifier in there introduces noise that's not really there in the recording. So sometimes you have to record and then play it back on another device in order to know whether there was really hiss or not. Right. But it is true that a lot of preamps, when you go up after 50 or 60 or 70%, you start to get noise. But that's not the case with the most recent 2 that I have been testing from IK Multimedia. Something has changed, and even when you max it out all the way, you don't hear any noise.
That's pretty cool, because on the Focusrite Scarlett 2 i2s that I have, and I've actually, encouraged some of my clients to get a 2 i2 because it's a good unit. But man, if you have to turn the preamp above, like, it's really high, like if you go like 90% or more, something weird happens. It's like it almost like boosts it another 20 dB and distorts it and introduces noise. It's like the noisiest, messiest, horriblest sound ever when you go like 95% or higher or something like that. And it's weird. So it's good to know that the newer devices, and it makes sense that these manufacturers are figuring that out, because they're not, they're not selling to audio engineers. They're selling to the regular public, and you can't you can't hand a preamp to just a regular person and tell them, oh, but don't turn it up past 6 or 7. That doesn't make sense.
Exactly. And this one that I'm speaking through right now, which is the iRig Pre HD, it came out really quickly. It was only about 4 months ago when I reviewed the predecessor. And it seems like there's an expression, and I think in English the way people say it is, the third is the charm. Have you heard that expression?
Yes, third time's the charm.
Exactly. Well, the first one that they made in this series didn't have any monitoring output at all. It was good quality, it just had no monitoring output. The second one, which came out approximately 4 months ago, which was the iRig Pre-IO, that one did have a headphone monitoring output, but there was no direct latency-free monitoring. So it was software dependent, and of course it had latency or delay, as we generally call it more in the television world, in the video world. It's basically the same thing, latency and delay. And now this one, the iRig Pre HD, the third is the charm. It's the first one that actually does have hardware-based latency-free monitoring, and it's switchable. Nice. And not only that, because they don't clarify it in the explanation on the web, but I will in my review, it does work even when it's on, which is right now, and I'm hearing myself through it. I'm also hearing what comes from the computer, so I'm hearing you.
Right.
In some devices, you can only hear what's going into it, but not what's returning from the computer. In this case, I'm hearing both, and I hear both even if I switch it off, because I tested that. I'm not going to do it right now, but I already tested it before, and if I shut it off, I continue to hear what's coming from the computer, but I don't hear it from myself. There are some people who are not used to hearing themselves when they talk, but I think anybody who works in radio is familiar with hearing themselves when they talk.
Yeah, you get used to that.
And in the word of telephony, when you hear yourself when you talk on a regular landline phone, there's an actual technical word for that, and it's called side tone, when you hear yourself while you talk.
Really?
talking to let you know that you're actually connected as opposed to having a dead line.
Side tone.
Side tone. Yeah, it's a compound word. SIDETONE. Side tone.
That's pretty cool. So before I forget, I wanted to mention that you said right now you're going through the IK Multimedia iRig Pre HD, and it's set to 48 kilohertz.
Yes.
We are connected over the internet through Chrome. Well, we're both using Chrome, but we're using Zencastr, right? The VoIP recording service. One thing I know about Zencastr is Zencastr takes the incoming audio and changes it to 44.1. And that's why I've had a couple issues with people, like, and even over the VoIP right now for your voice, I hear clicking quite often, and I'm really hoping that clicking does not make it onto the final recording. I don't think it will, because I think that's a VoIP issue. Like, that's the sound of your voice coming over the internet and getting messed up. But
I hope that's the case.
Yeah, but
Zencastr, we're hearing a preview quality.
Yeah, so Zencastr is obviously recording a local copy of you on your machine that doesn't go over the internet, so hopefully that doesn't have the clicks on it, which I'm sure it doesn't. But it still has to change that 48 kilohertz signal from your interface into 44.1 to go through
Yes,
the
that's
internet.
the reason why I don't use it. I had some conversations with the guy who programmed it,
Josh.
and he said that he was unable to do that at the present time based upon the technology that's available in the browsers right now.
Right.
But I didn't know, since your green room was disguising what actual service you were using. I didn't know which service you were using, and otherwise I would have perhaps changed that before. But you'll let me know later.
Yeah.
How it works out with the actual recording.
Yeah, I'm sure it'll be fine. I hear through Zencastr, I quite often hear little clicks or little weird things or even glitches, but they don't make it to the final recording. Sometimes they do, which is really nasty. Like, sometimes there is some clicking that ends up in the final MP3, and that's something I still can't comprehend. It's like, but anyway, actually, I just signed up for Ringer because I want to try Ringer. Have you used Ringer at all, Alan?
Yes, I reviewed it, and they have improved it since I reviewed it. I reviewed it at least 6 or 8 months ago.
Oh, okay.
And I loved the way it worked. The reason that I even thought about reviewing it is because they were one of the ones that did and still does support 48 kilohertz.
Nice.
Directly. It's just a setting. I imagine that you got the Pro one. The Pro one, you can set it up in advance to be 48 kilohertz. And they actually, I'm trying to remember the name for it now, but they use a type of codec which is lossless but compressed.
Oh yeah, FLAC.
Exactly, FLAC, which reminds me of that movie about Meet the Fockers or something like that, because that meme of the Kodak reminds me of that, and I even mentioned it in the review because it sounds like, you know.
Are you saying that the people over at Ringer are flackers?
Well, it makes sense because it makes the file lighter without abusing the quality at all. It is
right.
Considered lossless. And some people are even saying that eventually distribution will go that way for shows like this one. There are other people who get HD audio versions of music, and I think some of those are already in that format. But I think the general public doesn't know about it that much yet.
Yeah. And there's still, wars, not really wars, but there's still a lot of controversy in the podcasting world about mono versus stereo, just to save file size. It's like, I listened to a show, who was it? Was it someone who was looking into podcast engineering school for the next semester, or it was someone, and I listened to their show. Oh, I know what it was. It was a reviewing someone's show. Someone who was in Podcasters Society, Daniel J. Lewis. He runs these like webinars every couple weeks, and he actually reviews them. He picks one member and reviews their show. It's awesome. And now that I'm an expert contributor to Podcasters Society, which I have been for a while. When I can, I'll listen to the show and just give my feedback. And the show was in mono, which, okay, it's mono, but first of all, music in mono just sounds terrible. I mean, it just sounds weird. It's like you start turning your head. Is like, is something wrong? What's wrong? Like you don't know what's wrong,
if
but
it's
something's
music
wrong.
That was made for stereo.
But anyway, it's people want to just get down the file size, so they use mono, and so I can't imagine that anyone would want to put out their podcast in FLAC. And I was just wondering, maybe I'll have to do a test for this. The file size difference between a FLAC and an MP3 at 320 kilobits per second. I wonder what the file size difference is. I
don't know off the top of my head, but I know it will be heavier.
Yeah, the FLAC's probably bigger, right?
Yes, the FLAC is bigger, but much smaller than what a wave would be.
Got it.
And there are more and more software that can read it directly, and there are also plugins for, at least for Mac OS, that makes the actual operating system read it. Even if the particular app doesn't, it becomes invisible to the app once that plugin is installed.
Oh, that is cool. All right, well, let's switch over to Hindenburg Journalist Pro. Now, I haven't tried this software, but I've seen it at a couple shows, and I know people love it. And it's like you said, it's much more broadcaster friendly and storytelling friendly, without all the bells and whistles for a rock band. But do you record directly into Hindenburg Journalist Pro when you record?
I have, and I sometimes do, like when I was doing my initial test recordings of this iRig Pre HD, but I don't generally do it anymore ever since, I have to do it like a sidetrack and then come back to Hindenburg Journalist Pro. Sure. One of the features in Hindenburg Journalist Pro is that you can record Skype with it. But recording Skype using the API, which stands for Application Programmers Interface, if I'm remembering correctly, is dangerous because Skype is constantly changing things, and sometimes they shut it off and they turn it back on and they make a change, and it just throws a curve to the software that's designed to work with the API.
Got it.
So then there are other software to record Skype that are specifically designed not to use the API, so they will be immune to that situation. Even though they have less features, at least that they won't have that issue. So ever since Skype threw a curve, I stopped using it for that, and therefore basically, and I think only a couple of times when I had a multi-mic input interface here, I did an interview that way. But now I'm more comfortable if I'm not doing anything to do with a remote interview, like an in-person interview in the studio. I'm just better off. I feel more comfortable using the H5 and then moving it to the computer later. Of course, I do a multi-track recording, and I even use this special feature from Auphonic, which is called cross-gating.
Ah, yes.
You're familiar with cross-gating. In other words, we don't want the spill from one microphone to the other. So what they do is they do it via software. You upload the 2 mono wave files, or the 3 or the 4, it doesn't matter how many. And it's analyzing each one so it knows which voice is which. And it's basically shutting off the mic of the person that's not speaking. So it gets rid of the crosstalk, the spill from one microphone to the other. So I love that. So that's the way I've been doing it lately, both in the field and in the studio here. I was in Mexico. I did a recording there. I did some other recordings when I was in Portugal, and with the H5 and 2 different microphones. One of them is a dynamic, and the other one is actually a head microphone that we can talk about later, but I don't want to get too far away from the Hindenburg question.
Yeah. Well, before we get back into Hindenburg, though, I want to ask you about the H5, because I have the H6, and I've used it several times, maybe 10 times I've used it, so I haven't used it a ton. But the mic pre's on there, like, I'm a guy who I want to crank up the mic pre as loud as I possibly can and record it. Like, I literally want it to peak at 0, in the best case scenario. Usually I back it down a little just for headroom. But on my H6, when I put up the mic pre, even when it starts to peak around -6, and I think between -6 and 0, that's like kind of gets like the red section. even if it's jumping up toward -6, I listen back to the recording, and sometimes I hear like this weird little compression thing, and it's like almost like it was like the mic pre was recorded too loud. I mean, is that what you've found with your H5? That, I mean, do you really have to record at a much lower level to avoid any of that weird nonsense?
I follow the -12 dB when I'm doing the raw recordings, and then I do the normalization later, just to have the headroom in case the person, because as you've covered in other shows, right, we don't have a hardware limiter in the at least in the H5. It's a software limiter, so I don't want to clip. And what I do in order to compensate the fact that I'm recording lower is I do record at 24-bit.
Right.
So I have, if you give me a second, I'll tell you exactly how many steps. Just a second here.
Oh, yeah, the difference in resolution between 24-bit and 16-bit?
Yes.
Yeah, I teach that in the podcast engineering school. It is shocking. It is shocking
Yes.
how much more resolution 24-bit gives you.
Exactly. So when you record that way when you normalize, you're still within the range, so you don't have the artifacts when you and the way my workflow with that is I record multi-track mono 48 kilohertz 24-bit, and then I upload those individual files to the Auphonic cross-gating feature.
Right.
And then I get a mono back that already has been cross-gated and already at -16 loofs, and then I use that for editing. So that makes my editing much easier, because I'm basically concentrating at that point at the content, not at the levels, because it's already cross-gated and it's already leveled. But even if that were not the case, even if I were not doing it that way, one of the nice things in Hindenburg Journalist Pro is, and it's designed for people who might be doing an audio documentary, and they might be getting audio clips from all different types of sources, not only ones that the producer records him or herself, but maybe even clips from the internet and things like that. So as soon as you drop a clip of audio on the timeline, it levels it according to the way they think it can be. And 99% of the time, it's perfect. Of course, you can override it whenever you want to, but it just saves you time when you're doing the craft of putting the story together. You don't have to stop to re-level each clip.
Right.
And it does it differently based upon how compressed each clip is, so that the perceived it goes together with what we've talked about before with LUFS, LUFS, the perceived loudness as opposed to the VU measurement of the level. So that really is a feature that's a killer feature to help you save time when you're editing with Hindenburg Journalist Pro. Because in other words, if I get a clip, there was one episode I did last year where I needed to get a clip of one of the presidential candidates, what he said in a news clip, and I was commenting around that, and I'm not going to run that through Auphonic. There's no reason. It's already recorded. But when I put it on the timeline, it just automatically puts it in the same level as what I have set for the project. So it's a time saver.
Yeah, that's super handy, and I definitely have to try that out at some point. The best thing I like about what you just said was that the loudness of each clip is determined automatically by Hindenburg, but it also takes into consideration the source material, meaning how compressed is that track, because that's one thing that is actually not, I won't say it's not easy, but it's not that hard, but it's not that easy, is to level two voices when one voice is compressed a lot and one voice is not compressed a lot. It put them side by side on two different faders and literally using your ears, try to level that out. It's not easy because
it's a challenge.
It's a challenge because it messes with your brain. It's like the compressed voice is really nice and kind of in your face and it stays in one spot. But then the other voice is like all over the place. It gets loud and soft, and it's like it's hard to determine where is that. When are they even? So if Hindenburg can do that and be right 99% of the time, that is really cool.
Yes, at least 99% of the time it does it perfectly. And one of the differences between the Pro version and the non-Pro version, which is a huge difference in price, is that the Pro version does include the actual Lufs meter, which I almost never turn on because it just does its job so well that I don't need to. Mm-hmm. And the other difference is that you can set the project target Lufs level to be one of 3 or 4 different standards that exist, right. Whereas in the non-Pro version, it doesn't give you that option, but it does allow you to share the final export to be at minus 16 LUFS, because as we know, that's a standard, at least when it's going to be stereo. So the consumer version of the Hindenburg Journalist Pro can share it at minus 16 LUFS. It doesn't give you the other options, which are more appropriate for television in the US, television in Europe, or radio in certain regions. Mm. But at least it has minus 16 LUFS, which is basically the standard for anything that's going to be online or in a mobile device. At least when it's stereo. Some people argue about 19 if it's going to be mono, but I don't distribute in mono, so I don't worry about 19.
Right. Okay, so you said within Hindenburg, and I've heard this before, that within Hindenburg, you can literally connect a Skype account and record a Skype conversation right into Hindenburg. But you said that requires the use of an API, which sometimes if Skype changes something, then that'll mess up the API and there can be problems. So you said there are some Skype recorders that don't use the Skype API. What are they? To
my knowledge, and any of the listeners should verify this to make sure that it's still true, but the one that's considered very, very good and very foolproof, although it does have a few settings to determine how it behaves, the one from Ecamm, the Skype recorder from Ecamm, which is spelled ECAMM, I believe does not use the API.
Got it. It just takes the audio from Skype and records it, and you can have it recorded on its own track.
Yes, and Ray Ortega has done a YouTube review on that program. So shout out to Ray and anyone who wants to see that. Ray did a great review of a Ecamm recorder, a Skype recorder.
Ray Ortega. I love that.
Yes, who always emphasizes that he does not speak Castilian and he was adopted, and he actually edits a show in Castilian, which is the proper name for the language that a lot of people call Spanish, but there are many Spanish languages, and the one that is spoken from Mexico all the way to Argentina is properly called Castilian. Well, he edits a show in that program, and he's able to do it even though he doesn't speak the language, and he clarifies to people, because a lot of people think that because of his last name he might speak it.
Wow.
And in any case, he does some great reviews, and I actually became aware of a brand that you might say is a namesake to me, Allan and Heath, because of one of his reviews. He recently reviewed a mixer from them, although I actually became more enchanted with one of their broadcast boards, which he has not reviewed, at least to date, which is the XB14-2, which is a very interesting broadcast board from Allan and Heath, which is from the UK. And it's interesting to know also, in the United States we use the term mix minus, but that's not the word they use there. So if you're looking in the specs, you might not immediately realize that it does mix minus. They just call it telco, which is a short name for telephone company. Huh. But that's just the word that they use for mix minus. I don't know if I should say that they never say mix minus, but in the literature of the XB14-2, they call it telco. But if you read it, you figure out that it is a predetermined mix minus for that input, or those two inputs in the case of this one, because that one is actually made so that you can have two guests simultaneously, and it's broadcast in the sense that it has the auto muting for the monitors for the talent, so that they know instantly when they're on air or not.
Right. And so, all right, I want to ask you about these other audio interfaces you've used and reviewed, specifically the multi-input ones, the ones that accept either 2 XLR mics or maybe even 4 or 8 XLR microphones. What are some of the best one, or what is the best one that you've tried out?
Okay, probably the best one that I've ever tried is the little little brother or little sister of the one that you just received from Sound Devices. You, I believe, received the 6, and I did a complete review of the 3.
Oh.
I specifically preferred the 3 for the review that I did. So that's probably the cleanest one. But what's interesting is, I guess the ones that I've done with more inputs were a year or two ago already. I think they were from Roland. But probably the absolute cleanest and best preamps have been from Sound Devices. And that was painful when I had to return that one, because that one had to be returned. I imagine that yours also, unless you decide to buy it. But some companies say that you have to return it, and that's fine. But there are some other ones that I am very, very interested in. Give me a second, and I'll tell you the name. Have you heard of the name Audient? Audient?
I've heard the name. I don't know anything about them.
They're also from the UK, and what's interesting from them, and it's something that they don't lie the way, I don't know why, but Zoom for a while has been saying that the 6 and the 5 and the 4, I forget what letter they put after the 4, that they all have the same preamp, and they don't. If you go to the specs, they have completely different maximum gain specs. So I don't know why the marketing people dare to say that they all share the same preamps. But in Audient, they have full consoles, and then they have these interfaces, including the Audient ID14, and then there's a smaller one which only accepts one, which is $100 less. But they all do share the same preamp, which in the case of theirs, they specifically say that it has 66 dB of gain, and they put in parentheses, including plus 10 dB via software. What's not clear to me is whether or not the software actually does the boosting, or if it just tells the hardware to boost another 10. I hope it's the latter, but I'm not sure. But in any case,
I would think it's the former. Because when I spoke to Paul Isaacs, who was on this show a while back, I'm confused because when we're recording this and when it's going to be on.
Yes, I just heard that episode this morning. So
yes,
I have
Paul
it fresh
Isaacs
in my mind.
Yeah, so the 96 dB of gain in the Mix Pre 6 and the Mix Pre 3, only 76 of it is from the Mic Pre. 20 dB is after the fact. It's almost like a fader it's like a monitor fader. You can crank it up 20 more dB, but that's almost like playback. So I would imagine that what you're talking about with this Audient ID14, that the extra 10 dB is probably on playback.
Well, I was only hoping.
Yeah,
but in that
know.
case, then it's 56 instead of 66.
Right, I know.
If that's the case, I'm not sure, but they're renowned to be one of the cleanest. They're obviously in a completely different position than the devices that you and I have been using recently from Sound Devices, because these are not recorders. The ones that you and I have been recording or been testing are also recorders,
right,
where the Audients are interfaces only, the ID14, and I think the smaller one is called the ID4. The Audient ID14 is only $299, and it has these amazing preamps. There are some other ones that I've tried and that I was disappointed. Some of the ones from Behringer that cost under $100. It seems like the ones that don't want to really publish their gain, and you have to actually download the manual and look into the schematic to find out. Those are the ones that are a little bit, especially if you want to use it with a dynamic mic. It's different if you want to use it with a condenser mic.
Right.
But if you want to do it with a condenser mic, by the time you buy one of those and then you buy 2 or 3 FET heads,
oh jeez,
you might as well have just bought an Audient ID14, because it starts to add up. It's different if it's only for one dynamic mic, but if it's going to be 2 or 3, add it up. $99 for the interface plus another $90 for each one of the FET heads. Why don't you just buy one that already has enough gain? It sounds like you agree with me from your laugh.
Can you actually daisy chain FET heads? Did anyone ever try that?
I don't know if anyone would want to have more than 25 or 27 dB of pre-gain, but The FET head is actually sold in several different varieties. The most standard one is the one that does not send out phantom power on the end that's supposed to be connected to the microphone, because that one is generally connected only with either a ribbon or a dynamic mic. So the most standard FET head does not put out phantom power on that end of it, but it receives it just to do its gain. But there's another one that's actually called the FET head Phantom, and that's to use in those rare cases where you have a condenser mic and you still need extra gain with a condenser. So theoretically, you could have one of them closest to your interface and then a standard at the other end, and then you could get about 50 in advance. But I don't know if there would really be a situation where you would need so much pre-gain.
That's funny.
But I think technically it would work, because that one does put out phantom power on the end that normally goes directly connected to the microphone. So anyway, I'm trying to see if I can give you any other answers regarding interfaces. I think no. I think maybe about consoles. But at some point, I would like to talk about some of the other microphones and their pros and cons.
I was just going to ask you about, let's talk a couple more microphones before it's time to go. But real quick, I just want to remind everyone, my guest today is Allan Tepper, and his website is allantepper.com. And of course, the links will be in the show notes. So microphones. So obviously you like the Rode Broadcaster. What other mics do you really like, Allan?
Okay, well, I want to give a shout out to a guy named Matt Ryjelski. I don't know if you know who he is, but he is a guy who proved on YouTube that if you do a specific, if you put a very specific windscreen on the SM57, which is a Shure, then it can sound virtually the same as an SM7B at a fraction of the price. And I took that to a next level, which I'm going to describe in a minute. But he has a video where he actually has side by side an SM57 and an SM7B, which is a $400 microphone. And he basically goes back and forth, and they sound virtually identical. But what is that special windscreen? It's a special windscreen from Shure, which is called the A81WS. It's huge. It makes it look almost as big as an SM7B, even though it's only a microphone like the SM57. So I recommend you and any of the listeners to listen to his comparison online. It's Matt Ryjelski, which is spelled Rygelski. I took that to another level because there's a little brother microphone that I forget the gentleman's name, but when you had a guest from Shure, he mentioned it very, very briefly. It's the 545 from Shure, which is in the consumer line, but it has the exact same capsule as the SM57. Costs about $20 less, and it actually has a feature that's not included in the SM57. So I reviewed that one with the A81WS on it, and it was amazing. And that's the one that I use in the field to interview people when I do a semi-formal interview in the field. I sit down and I actually have a desk microphone stand that I bring with me, and that's the one that I put on the talent. And I tell them practically to eat the microphone, because that foam is so thick that it's impossible to make it pop.
Right.
So it sonically changes the way the SM57 or the 545, which has some advantages that I covered in the article. So that's amazing in itself. And that was an interesting experiment that I did, and I have it in front of me right now. The 545, I happen to love palindromic numbers, where it's just a number when you read it backwards and forwards, it's the same thing. But you actually save some money on that, and I put it together with that and a shock mount from Shure also. So that's basically the combination. But to add on top of that, there's another microphone that you probably haven't heard of, and it's from Pyle, Pyle. And a lot of people say that this microphone, which is the exact model number is PDM MIC78, that microphone, a lot of people say that it's a knockoff of the 57, which is the one, for those who don't remember the difference between the 57 and the 58, the 58 is the one that has the ball, and it's generally used for speaking even without a pop filter, and the 57 is used more often with instruments, although it's also the presidential microphone for the past 30 years or more. In fact, your guest from Shure mentioned that.
Yeah,
that
Michael
with a
Pedersen.
windscreen on it is the one that's been used to do all the inaugurations of the U.S. presidents.
And you know what I just saw recently was I saw Tom Petty doing Unplugged probably about 20 years ago, and he literally was singing into a 57 with no pop filter at all. Zero. And I
Wow.
was like, how is he doing that? Like, how are they controlling that? And I was trying to listen for P's, but I don't know, maybe his voice almost sounded delicate. Like maybe he doesn't pop the air that much. So anyway, I thought that was very interesting.
I'm sure he must have been using a 45-degree angle, which is what I'm doing right now. Did you notice if he was using a 45-degree angle?
He was using different angles. At times, he was
Okay.
right on it. Like, his lips were literally on it. And I'm like, how can that not be popping? You know, I've tried that. We all tried that with a 57. Just grab it and talk right into it. It pops like bad. So,
Yeah,
anyway, it was
you put
interesting.
the A81WS and it transforms it. It sonically transforms it. It's just amazing.
Right.
I'm sure that Barry would like that.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
So anyway, this microphone that some people call a knockoff, I wouldn't call it a knockoff. If you actually, there are a lot of reviews on this microphone on YouTube, but very few of them actually do it with voice. Most of them are doing it with to mic either drums or a guitar amp or something like that. But the few that do review it for voice, it actually sounds brighter than the 57. So that microphone, which costs, when I bought the one that I have here, it'll only cost $10, but now it fluctuates between $10 and $20. It seems like every week it changes.
Huh.
That microphone actually sounds a lot like the 57. It has the exact same dimensions, so it fits in the A81WS. You know, it has to be a very narrow microphone in order to fit into that special windscreen that Shure sells. And that windscreen is almost $30 in itself, but it's well worth it. It's just amazing. It not only aesthetically, but also how it affects the sound and how it makes it immune to pops.
Wow.
So what I plan to publish soon is a review of the PD Mic 78 from Pyle in the A81WS, because it's a little bit brighter. So it actually has a better high frequency response than the 57, which is no knock to the 57. I mean, the 57 is really targeted more for drums, so you don't really need high frequencies for drums. But it's just an amazing microphone for the price. So you get that. You're going to spend more for the windscreen than you are for the mic. But if the end result is good, it doesn't matter.
That's so funny. I'm looking up this Pyle mic. It looks exactly like a 57.
Yes, but I don't think we should consider it as a knockoff for the 57. I think we should consider it to be its own entity. And one thing that was bad with it, which apparently changed recently, was up until recently, there were two things that were wrong with it, which were correctable if you're a person who doesn't mind opening it up and soldering. But it was miswired as unbalanced, even though it should be balanced. You know, just because it has an XLR, it doesn't mean that it's balanced. In fact, I did a recent article about balanced and the 3 different versions of balanced. That can be corrected. And the other thing was it was not matching the EIA standard of RS-297A, which I'm sure you know means that pin 2 is hot. About 50 years ago or something like that, there was a mess, and some microphones were pin 2 hot, and some were pin 3 hot, and finally the EIA set a standard, and basically everybody has been following it since then.
Right.
And it's not a problem if you're only using that microphone. The problem is if you try to combine it with another microphone that does meet the standard, because then you're going to have phase cancellation.
Oh.
So that can be corrected by soldering it. But now there's a guy on YouTube who bought a batch for his church a year ago, and he had to resolder all of them, and he didn't mind. He's a guy who doesn't mind opening a microphone and resoldering. And he opened the new batch, which arrived just recently, and he opened it up, and he said, wow, they must have been watching, because several people have done videos about how to do that correction in the PD Mic 78,
Right.
and it was already wired for balanced.
Oh.
So I immediately wrote to the guy, and I said, thank you, that's great news. Now, when I recommend this to people, I don't have to tell them that they have to open it up just to make it balanced, because there are a lot of advantages to balanced, as I'm sure you know.
Yeah.
And I asked him, do you know if it now complies with EIA standard RS-297A, meaning is pin too hot? And he said, I don't know, but I'll check. And he hasn't responded yet.
Oh.
But, if you're only using those microphones, it doesn't matter. It doesn't affect your final, as long as you're hearing it fine, it's fine. It's a question of using multiple microphones beyond the issue of spill, which we discussed before, making sure that there's not going to be phase cancellation among the microphones. So
Right.
I'm blown away by the economy and the sound of it, especially when you put it together with this magical A81WS windscreen, which is just makes it look like a huge microphone. It looks almost as big as an SM7B.
That's so interesting. I'm looking at the mic now. I'm going to have all the links to all these stuff we're talking about in the show notes. But yeah, it looks like a 57. It's $11.41.
Yeah, it fluctuates. So don't be surprised, listeners, if you look for it on Amazon. It might be as high as 20. It might be as low as 10. When I bought it was only 10. So it fluctuates all the time. And theoretically, you won't even have to modify it anymore. It'll just be balanced already.
Right? That's so cool.
And it's easy to find out if you open it up. You can just see if they've done it right or not.
Yes. Well, that's so interesting. We're out of time, Allan. This has been awesome.
Likewise.
I think
It's
there's
been a
so
lot of
much
fun.
more we could talk about. I think we'll, after a little while, maybe you should come back and we should talk about some other cool stuff.
Whenever you want. I'm sure I'll have reviewed a lot of more things by the time that happens, because even the next few days I'm going to be testing more equipment that has arrived. So that's great, and make sure that you give a good cup of coffee to Barry for me.
I will, and that's Barry's laugh. I love his laugh. So I also can you take a picture of your workshop there with all the kinds of gear strewn about and send me a picture for the post?
Sure.
That'd be awesome. So Allan Tepper, pro audio and video specialist, tech journalist, allantepper.com, on a road broadcaster, which I'm so psyched that I'm pretty soon I'm going to have mine within a matter of hours. Although this isn't going to be the last session you're going to hear of me on the RE20, because I know I have 3 or 4 sessions that are going to come out. Oh, no, wait. I'm so confused when I record in advance. Anyway. All right. Well, thanks, everybody, for listening. Allan, thank you so much, man.
Thank you.
All right. We'll see you all next time. Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed it. And as always, Allan, sound great!
Sounds great.
Yeah, baby!
And overmatched.
You walk away from me, well, and you can't play that part so well. What do you say?